Hey YouTube, it's Dimitri. Today we're going to talk about decisioning. So I'm going to call this the evolution of decisioning. This really comes down to, why we need models. Just a quick presentation. I'm going to give you a little bit of a history here, as we'll see here on the first kind of slide. I'm going to lay out why we need models, why humans are somewhat weak, and how models actually help us make better decisions. So let's just dive on in here. Okay, so as I mentioned here, understanding the evolution of human decisioning, so how humans make decisions in the real world, I think is a really important perspective in understanding why we need models. And then it will also kind of play into how models work, right? They're somewhat logical, they make sense in many ways. We'll talk a little bit about that as we get going here, but there's nothing to be afraid of. And we'll talk about the weaknesses and pitfalls at the end as well. But there are going to be some things that we need to consider, but at the end of the day, right, they're going to do things kind of as we expect because we humans are the ones that design these models. Okay, so to start off with here in simple terms, right, let's think about this from caveman times. So let's go all the way back, let's say the beginning of time here, right? Cavemen needed to make decisions based on good or bad, right? It's a binary outcome. Something is either good or it is bad here. So if you look at this slide, on the left-hand side, right, we have this fierce lion here. We can say, is it good or bad in regards to safety? Of course, this is bad, right? A lion is aggressive. It could eat us. It is a bad thing in the sense of safety. On the right-hand side, right, we have a gazelle. Again, taking this from the perspective of safety, is a gazelle good or bad? It is good, right? It doesn't provide us necessarily any great advances in safety, but there's nothing to worry about with a gazelle, right? It's just eating grass, roaming the plains, right? There's no real concern here. So in a decisioning standpoint, humans start off with this very simple evolution here of good and bad. So animals do the same thing, even things that don't have necessarily as much cognition as a human. But in general here, right, you're going to have to be able to discern good versus bad. Now we can advance a little bit. So let's look at a baby, right? A baby's just kind of advancing in the real world. It's going to have different things it's going to look at that are going to be good and bad. And let's take this into consideration as safety again here. On the left-hand side, you see this is a burner, right, from like a stove. So it cooks food. It has other purposes. But from a baby's perspective, right, it is hot. It will burn you. It is bad. So again, babies typically touch hot things or outlets or electrical things, and it shocks them and they realize this is bad, right? This is all they're kind of categorizing here is good or bad. On the right-hand side, right, you're going to see some wood play blocks. Kids like them. They're bright colored. They're fun to play with. So is it good or bad? It's going to be good safety-wise, right? Kids can play with them. They're not getting hurt. At least not for the most part here. So again, from a baby perspective of evolution decisioning, these are good. Now, there comes a point in a lot of this decisioning where there is going to be a life or death situation. So again, as I mentioned in the caveman slide here, there was the lion, and the lion was big and scary and bad, and it could be life or death here. These slides I wanted to highlight a little bit as well, looking at categorization here. So now we're not saying, so we are going to kind of say good and bad, but we need to categorize a lot of these things for food, whether it is edible, meaning it is safe or good, or whether it is poisonous, so it is going to be bad here. And this is where things get challenging, right? So in the caveman example and the baby example, we had very stark differences of, a lion versus a gazelle, and a burner versus, some wood blocks. But life gets a little more complicated in the real world as we evolve. And so as humans have evolved over time, one of these key characteristics here is learning what is good and bad. And often, it takes a little bit of trial and error. And so these pictures here, I just wanted to kind of show you a little bit. These are going to be different types of food. So the pictures on the left, these look like grapes or berries of some sorts here. And one of these is going to be safe to eat, and one is going to be poisonous and will kill you. So again, right, as a human, if you're not well-versed, this isn't what you're doing on a daily basis, right? So even for someone like me, right, I live in the city, I go to the grocery store, I purchase my food, I know it is safe. In an example, when you're harvesting from the wild, this is a great example of, is this safe to eat? I don't know, right? This is getting a little dicey here. You're going to have to look at other cues, perhaps like the leaf shape, or different kind of characteristics maybe on the sheen on the berry, for example. The right-hand side is another great example here. Again, things that are going to be wild, things that are growing. I believe one of these is a wild carrot, so it is edible. And I believe the other two are going to be poisonous, things that look similar, but they're not going to be exact. So as humans here, we need to kind of boil down what is good, what is bad. right? What is edible, what is not edible, and this could be life or death. So this decision is going to be critical. Again, you need to look at this from two perspectives here. So look at this a little bit outside of our, nice friendly realm here at the grocery store. But think about this in the wild. If you were back in the day, we didn't have grocery stores. You could either starve to death because you don't have enough food, so you need to eat something and find something. But on the other hand, right, you need to find something that's safe to eat, something that's reliable. So you're kind of weighing these pros and cons, and the decisions are getting a little bit more challenging. And so we're going to go into categorization here on this next slide. And I'm going to think Maslow's hierarchy, and we'll cover Maslow's hierarchy here in a second. But we have different categories now. So I made sure at the beginning here that I mentioned, that like the lion and the gazelle were in the framework of safety. What is safe, good or bad? When we start categorizing, though, there are going to be things that fall into different categories where it might be good in one category, bad in another category. So in this example here on the bottom left, we have honeybees. So, right, as a food source, honey is good, right? It is somewhat nutritious. It doesn't spoil. It stores for a while. That can be used as a natural sweetener, right? It is honey. It is a good food source here. So if you start looking at honeybees from a safety perspective here, it is going to be marked as bad, right? There is a scenario where you get stung, which is not good, right? It doesn't feel good. There's definitely a possibility, you could have an allergic reaction, you could swell up, and you could stop breathing, and you could die. So honeybees from a safety perspective are going to be bad here. And I just want to kind of point out here a little bit, right, the categories before we dive into Maslow's hierarchy, right? There's different categories such as safety, food, shelter, even relationships. So something that is, not as tangible or as hard as looking at, like animals and blocks and burners and things that are like in the real world, but things that are emotionally effective to us as well can be viewed as good or bad. And so things start getting a little more complicated now as we kind of progress past the caveman and past, the baby stages here. And we start having these scales and gradients in our decision making here. And one of the key reasons we have scales is that we have limited resources. Okay, so we only have so much time, for example, to gather food. We only have so much time to build structures, so like safety, for example, to keep us out of the weather. We only have so much time, for example, in the modern realm to make money, and that money can be used to purchase food and shelter and toys and entertainment, and other things to take care of our families. So you need different things to survive, and there are a limited number of resources. Time being one of the biggest ones. Again, money, so conversion of time and labor into money so you can purchase other things being another constraint here. And so we end up with this gradient here of good versus bad. And now things start becoming a little fuzzy, right? It's not like, so you think about working. Let's give you an example of how to work here. Let's say you work your entire life and you spend none of your time with your family, your kids, or anybody else, right? Working is good. It provides you money and means to, make money and do things and go on vacations and purchase food and everything. But there is going to be a trade-off here of how many hours should you really be working? Are you really going to be making that much more money, right? Maybe you're that guy that's working that job, it's salaried, and you're working your entire life on this and you don't get promoted and nothing changes. And so the question comes back, should you really have been working all those hours? So this is an example of this gradient where working, your full 40 hours, doing your due diligence, making sure everything's done correctly, that's going to be a benefit for you, but it's not going to be, extreme working. You're going to be trading off with leisure, right? So how much time should you spend with your family? How much time should you spend on your mental health, right? Relaxing, doing other things that you enjoy here. So I hope you guys can kind of see a little bit here on this gradient that things aren't going to be as black and white as they were in the original examples. Life starts getting complicated when we start looking at different kind of spectrums and different trade-offs and trying to, again, optimize the resources that each one of us has. And I wanted to mention here Maslow's hierarchy kind of as a way of thinking about how humans might allocate resources. So somewhat of a psychology perspective on this, but somewhat economical. Again, Maslow's hierarchy, so the triangle here on the right, is it starts with the bottom being this is the most fundamental needs that you must have. You have to have these before you can have the next layer above it. So physiological needs, right? You need food to survive. You need air to breathe. Again, those are very specific things that you're going to need. Once you have those things, you're going to need, again, safety. So having, for example, like a house or a hut, or maybe you need a spear to fend off those lions, right? In the beginning example here. You're going to need safety, and then above that becomes love and belonging, and above that becomes esteem, and then finally you have self-actualization. So this presentation here is not going to be on Maslow's hierarchy, but you can see here on the allocation of resources, right, it's important to make sure that we have the physiological needs first, and then you build up through those layers and what you need to somewhat be a happy, well-rounded, put-together person. But again, we're going to be having these resource trade-offs here. And so, right, you can't just ignore physiological needs and say, I don't need food, I don't need water, I don't need air. I'm just going to go for, having friends and, being loved and belonging to a group, which is great. But again, you're going to still need to stay alive here. So this should just shed some light on the gradients of life, right? The trade-offs that we're going to have. Okay, and now we're going to talk about the human brain is somewhat limited. So don't get me wrong here at all. The human brain is amazing. It is super creative. It has a lot of features and functionality. But the issue with the human brain is that we cannot store every single piece of information, the basic record life and our perspective as like a video, right? A 24/7 video that's going, and you store every single piece of information here. So the way our brains are designed is that we hold in information that's relevant or pertinent to us, things that we're going to need, and simple things, for example, like, I don't know, the color of the car that passed me on the way to work today just fades away and we don't really remember it, right? It's not important. So your brain is going to categorize what you need to know and don't need to know because we do have some limitations. The memory of the past events, though, so all those things like that car that drove by that's a different color, it's extremely hard to remember things. And so our brain is somewhat limited, and we need to keep that in mind that we do have some sort of limitation, and we also tend to oversimplify. So again, as I mentioned here with the car driving by at work, let's say, I don't know, a dog ran across the road and I realized it was a Dalmatian, and there's all these little intricate facts. Our brain's going to start doing a simplification where, we remember a dog ran out in front of us, on the way to work. I remember a car passed me, perhaps aggressively, but I'm not going to remember a lot of the details on that it was a Dalmatian, or perhaps it was a red car, maybe it was a Corvette or something. We need to simplify things so that we can mentally process them. And a lot of times we're going to oversimplify things into, as I mentioned before, good and bad, and we're not going to quite remember that gradient of where on that scale things are going to fall. And it's very challenging. So again, there's been psychological studies and research into this, so you can look them up or Google them if you want. But human brains can only focus on so many tasks at once, and one task, focusing only on one task, you'll do it far better than trying to multitask. So multitasking is not great. You'll see here with decisioning, right, as we get going into models, a lot of times making one decision is dependent on multiple variables. And we have all these different components we need to think about. And as a human, it's hard to think about them all. So one way we get around that is we write them down on paper. We take notes, right? And we try to track all this information and put them all together. And eventually that ends up being somewhat of a model. You can think of it as a logical model, right? If you're just writing things out. And you'll see here we'll start using statistics and other complicated or more complicated approaches to kind of modeling these so that we can make better educated decisions here. And then finally, to wrap up this slide here, reality is extremely complex. One of the largest challenges in finance and banking and many other areas is that we're trying to model human decisioning, and humans are very irrational. So people are shocked when I say this, right? Oh, they're very rational. What I mean by this is that humans are very complex. A lot of times we don't see all the inputs into their model. So we make a decision and we think this is the most rational, outcome and decision possible. But a lot of times we forget that we have different circumstances than everybody else around us. So while this might be a good decision for me to say, I don't know, go to college or something, somebody else, it might not be the best fit, right? Their circumstances, their financing, maybe they have other desires and passions in life and they're going to go be, I don't know, the best actor out there or actress or something. And they go out and they're going on their venture, right? For them, that could be the best decision possible. For me, it's definitely not going to be the best decision. I'm not good at acting. But again here, there's going to be different complexities with humans, and trying to model them is extremely challenging as everything is always changing. As I've mentioned here, everything is very dependent on the individual and the circumstances that they're put in. And so I put an example here on the bottom of the slide as well, just to give you something a little more clear here. Let's say an example, buying $1 million car is wasteful, right? I completely agree with that. However, if one individual has enough money to complete their own needs, it could be okay, right? It could be a decent decision. So that Maslow hierarchy, let's say they have everything covered, they have tons of money, right? And they want to buy this car, So it makes sense in this case, if you're that billionaire, let's say, and you buy a car and it makes minimal impact on you, right? It could be a decent decision given what you want and kind of, having some fun and enjoying your earnings here. Now, on the other hand here, right, in this example, let's say somebody sells everything they own to buy the same car. Is this a good decision? No, this is not going to be a good decision here. And I think most of us would agree with this, right? You need other things like a house or a place to live, right? You perhaps need food, you need clothes, you need, take care of your family. So let's say, I don't know, your education for your kids and your retirement and other things. Let's say you sell everything and you go get this car, this $1 million car here, right? That's not going to be the best decision for you. I think most of us can agree on that, given the perspective what I've laid out here. But again, decisions are going to be dependent on the individual and their circumstances. And so that leads us to actually looking at models, right? What are models, right? Models can remember complex past data, trends, patterns, cyclicality, all these different components, basically in a mathematical form so that we don't have to try to do this with our limited brain power. We can utilize kind of that on-paper method where we're going to type in data in a computer, it's going to remember things for us, and it's going to come up with some way to actually give us the best decision here. We can have complex linear and nonlinear models. There's a lot of discussion around this for those in the modeling community. I'm not going to cover that here today though. And then finally, right, we have equality due to it being rule-based here. So there are ways where models can be biased and non-equal, and I'll explain that perhaps towards the end of this video. But equality is one of these things where a model is what a model is. So it has this mathematical structure. It doesn't matter who gets put into the model. You're going to get the best results for that individual based on a very strict, solid set of rules here. And because of that, right, everyone's going to get scored the same. So as long as you don't have crazy things in your models that discriminate against different individuals or people or groups or anything like that, you should be getting consistent output. And this is one amazing thing with models. This is one reason why, trading on the stock market, it's far better to use models a lot of times because you can get that consistency instead of having that emotional tie, right? A stock's going up, a stock's going down. I don't know, a news article came out, your best friend told you this stock was amazing, and so you want to buy it, but your model's telling you shouldn't buy it, right? That model's going to keep you somewhat grounded in the facts of these are the things that we're considering in the decision. It's only these things, and this is kind of our answer here. So they do have good uses in equality and fairness, but not a lot of people see that sometimes. And then we're going to do some modeling examples here just to give you an idea of what a model is and how it works. Decision trees are one of the simplest methods here. I'm just going to go through it briefly, explain what a decision tree is. This is a machine learning method. It's not scary or anything like that. But basically here we have this decision tree and it's answering the question, should you go outside? Okay. So let's say the first thing we're going to look at is what month are we in, right? If we're in October to March, we're going to go on this tree here to the left-hand side. If it's going to be April to September, we'll go to the right-hand side, right? So you're kind of getting the idea here, right? If it's going to be, kind of like that wintry, falling months, might not be the best idea. If it's going to be spring and summer, it might be fun to go outside. That's what we're trying to split here with the months. If you go to the left, so it's October to March here, right? The next question we're going to ask is the ground dry or is it snowy, right? We're in the winter months. It's probably going to be either dry or snowy, kind of our options here in most locations, especially in the north. And then depending if it's dry outside, our decision is we go outside. If it's snowy outside, we're going to stay inside. So now let's go to the other side of the tree here. If we're between April and September, we look at the sky is the next question. So all the questions here are in blue. And we say, okay, is the sky sunny or is it cloudy? If it's sunny, we're going to go outside, which is that left-hand decision. If it's cloudy, we're going to lead to another decision here, and it's going to say, okay, let's look at the clouds instead of the sky. So we know there's clouds now. Are the clouds light in color, so they white and fluffy and looks fun and exciting to go outside? Or are they dark and gloomy and it's probably going to rain here because we're in the spring or the summer? So if it's going to be light colored clouds, right, we're going to go outside, it's going to be fun. If it's going to be dark colored clouds, we're going to stay inside and try to avoid, getting caught up in a storm. So this is just the basics of how a decision tree works. If you have more data here, which I'll explain later, at the very ends of this, you can kind of take averages. So you look at the average of your data in that bottom one. So let's just say, I don't know, the months October to March, and then it's, go to the ground question, and we say, okay, it's dry, and that final decision is to go outside. A lot of times we'll have some data in there. Let's say, it has like good and bads. And, it says outside is good, and we have a whole bunch of those, and then we have, inside is going to be good as well, so maybe we mispredicted a few things. And then we're going to have outside is bad and inside is bad. So those are the 4 scenarios you can have. We would basically look at those and take the average and try to figure out, right, on average, if we're between October and March and the ground is dry, is it good to go outside, yes or no? That's kind of what we're trying to get at here. That's how these models will work in more complex situations. But this is just the basics of a decision tree, so I'm not going to cover all the details as I mentioned, but I'm hoping you kind of understand the basics here. As I mentioned here, we're going to kind of cut things up into different groupings. So this decision tree we can view in a different format here visually. This is called kind of like this mapping. I don't know, I call it like a segmentation map. It's the same thing, but it shows all the possible outcomes here. So this top left-hand box that is black is going to say, is it winter? Is the ground dry? If it is, you go outside. And then the bottom left one is going to say, you know, winter, not dry. So if you have snow or rain, probably going to stay inside here. That corresponds, though, to this decision tree on the left-hand side here, right? October to March was kind of that winter perspective. And then the ground decision, dry versus snow. And you'll see on that whole left-hand side of that tree, there's 2 decisions. Go outside, stay inside. That's what the second half, this left half of this kind of table here is showing here, this picture. And then if you look at the right-hand side, you'll see there's 3 different outcomes here, right? There's 2 that go outside, 1 that stays inside. If you go back here and look at this kind of map here, right, and look at the right-hand side, there's 2 outcomes that are to go outside, 1 to stay inside. I'll let you go through the scenarios here, but you can see that this actual kind of segmentation map shows you the same thing the decision tree shows you. It's just a different view of how the tree segments into these different scenarios here. And then let's do another example here. Let's do a decision tree, and this is going to be somewhat of a scale here. So it's not going to be binary of stay inside, go outside, right? We're going to do a credit score. So you think about your FICO score, for example, right? Or I don't know, your Equifax score or whatever. How does this work? This is just a general, super brief example. This is, you know, in the real world, you have far larger trees that are more complex and more decisioning that goes into it and a whole bunch of other things. This video is not to cover that. This is just to show you a potential of kind of how things work. So let's say you have income here. Let's say you have less than 30,000 or equal to it. We go to the left branch. If you have more than 30,000, you go to the right branch. Again, we'll start with that left branch here. Let's say you have credit history length is less than or equal to 6 years versus greater than 6 years. Right? We can logically think about this. So from income, right, if you have less money, the probability that you pay back a loan is going to be lower because you have less money, right? That's how loans work. If you had a ton of extra money, let's say you had $1 million, paying back this loan would be super, super simple. But on the left-hand side here, let's say, okay, we don't make that much money. That might predict it, but we want to add more layers to that, right? We want to be more scrupulous and give people a better chance, a better opportunity to get that loan, even though they make less than 30,000, right? So what we're going to look at here is credit history. So if you have credit history less than 6 years or equal to 6 years, so 6 years or less, it's going to give a specific score, right? So as I mentioned, we're going to average that group. So we've segmented it all out. We're going to take the average of this group, and that's the average score we're going to give that individual. Again, if you have less than 6 years, you might be pretty risky. If you go to the right-hand side there, you have greater than 6 years here. Now we're going to say, well, let's ask another question, right? You have a lot of credit history. You don't make very much money, but you do have a long credit history here. How many defaults have you had, let's say, in the last, I don't know, 6 years here, 5 years or something? You pick some value. If you have less than or equal to 2 defaults, you have 1 score. If you have greater than 2 defaults, you have a different score. So to go through this tree here, let's say you make 30,000 or less. You have more than 6 years of credit history, and you have less than or equal to 2 defaults in, let's say, the last 5 years. Your credit score will be some average of all these grouping of people that are just like you. So they meet all 3 of these criteria. Your credit score will be higher, and it should be higher than somebody, for example, who has less than 6 years of credit history because they're probably riskier. If you take that same decision tree though at the bottom, past defaults, let's say somebody else makes, 30,000 or less, and they have, greater than 6 years of history, but they have, 10 defaults in the last 5 years, right? We know they're risky. They've already defaulted on a bunch of other, loans, credit cards, mortgages, all kinds of products. And so because of that, they're going to be a high risk and their score will be lower, okay? This is kind of just the basics of how this tree is going to end up working. We look at these from a logical perspective. You do this with statistics as well and figuring out how to split and divide and select different categories. But let's look at the right-hand side of the tree now. Income here, right? Say you make more than 30,000. The next question is, how much credit is available to you? So what is the credit amount that you have available at your expense, right? If you've got a fairly good credit history, people have made you loans in the past, and now you have all this credit available. So let's say you have, $20,000, $30,000 in available credit through, for example, like credit cards. A lot of other companies have done some vetting on their own, and since you have a lot of credit available, you're probably going to be pretty safe. So if you have less than $5,000 or equal to $5,000 in this case, your score is going to be lower. If you have more than $5,000 credit available to you, you're probably going to be safer. But again, you still have to meet that initial criteria for the income here. So this is a very oversimplified model. This is not exactly how it's done in the real world, but it gives you kind of the structure of what actually occurs in the real world. That's a very simplified example. Okay, and then finally, to wrap this presentation up here, we're going to dive into linear models. So linear regression, which is a fairly simple method as well, but a little more complex than decision trees. It's going to look like this math equation to start with here. So we're going to go back to the weather example, and then we'll do a credit example, I believe. Let's say we look at outside. We want to predict that. Do you want to go outside or not? That's on the far left-hand side of this equation. You're going to have alpha on the right-hand side, which is just some intercept term. It just shifts your line up and down, helps you fit that data better. And then you're going to have months we're going to consider just like we did before. We're going to have ground moisture, which we discussed before in that decision tree, and we're going to have light. So light's going to be equivalent to like the cloud kind of concept here. But in this case, we're going to be looking at gradients here. So that decision tree was doing categorization in the sense that you had an exact value, right? You go outside, you don't go outside. Your credit score is exactly, this value. With linear regression, we're going to get that gradient that we've been missing here. And so the beta coefficient, so that crazy looking squiggly B here in front of, months, ground moisture, and light, is going to give me a specific value, and it's going to be applied the same for all of those things. So for example, in months here. So let's look at this bottom table and give you an example for a little more clarity. Okay, so the bottom right-hand table is going to say coefficient. That just means beta, that squiggly B. For months, it's going to be 0.083. So we're going to take the month value, 1 to 12, and we're going to multiply that by 0.083. And then we're going to add up our next consideration here. And so we're going to say, okay, that beta for the ground moisture is going to be negative 0.04. And we're going to multiply that by, some moisture value, let's say that ranges between 0% and 100%. And then we'll consider light, and we'll add in our alpha. And what this will do is will give us more of a gradient. So with the decision tree, right, we saw that we had the 2-month categories. You had the months that were going to be October to March, and then you had April to September, and that's going to be kind of our 2 splits. You have 2 categories. In this case here, months can take on the values from 1 to 12. So we have a lot more gradient before. We don't have 2 categories, we have 12 categories now. Again, for moisture and light, they're in percentages from 0 to 1. But it can range anywhere between 0 and 1. So you have some gradient, some adjustment between there. When you add up all these different components, it's going to give you some sort of value. And let's say it predicts a value between 0 and 1 as well. 0 is, let's say stay inside, and 1 is to go outside. If you run this model, you do a prediction, let's say it comes out with, 0.15, we say, okay, we stay inside, right? It's pretty close to 0. And you could draw a line in the middle and say anything that's going to be less than 0.5, we're going to stay inside. Anything 0.5 and greater, we're going to go outside, right? You can create these kind of rules with it, but this model is going to provide us a value or a score, let's say between the values of 0 and 1. And so we get kind of an idea of, okay, the likelihood or the probability of going outside and it being okay, right? Let's say the score is 0.7, 70% chance that it should be good to go outside. Anything less than 50, right, as we said before, we want to stay inside. Just doesn't seem like it's worth that risk, right? You're going to get wet, it's going to be cold, something's going to be wrong. But this is how a linear regression model works. We just have gradients of values that go in. There are statistical methods for fitting kind of these betas and choosing these values. It's not in scope of this, but we get this beta and it's used for everybody in every scenario. We get equality, we get fairness, we get consistency in the model, and it should fit pretty well. So this is kind of the basics of linear regression. And I'll mention too on the far right, there's that little squiggly E at the far right side of the equation. That just means our error. So in general, we're not going to predict things perfectly, right? We all know that. It's the real world. It's crazy. But those errors at the very end, that's the difference that will make essentially our value turn out to be either 0 or 1. Okay, so let's dive in now to linear regression for the credit example. So that credit decision tree with the score that we came up with earlier. And let's just figure out how to do this from a regression standpoint. One, this is an oversimplified example, as I've mentioned a million times. models in the real world have 30 plus variables often, 25 to 35, depending on the company, depending on the situation. This is overly simplified. This is fake data. I've made all this up just for kind of educational purposes. I just wanted to show you guys though here, we can look at income, for example. So let's say we put income into this model. We can look at the credit scores in the bottom, and you can see that, okay, the higher the income, the better the credit score. The lower the income, the worse the credit score. So this is what we consider a positive relationship. As income goes up, the credit score goes up, right? They're both going in the same direction. That is a positive relationship. Now looking back at this, right, we talked about credit history. So if you have a longer credit history, you're going to have, typically a safer person. They have more credit, they can manage it, they haven't had as many issues. And this is another example of, okay, logically, the longer the years, so as the credit history years go up, the credit score goes up. So we agree with this. This makes a lot of sense. And again, it is a linear relationship, which we're going to be modeling using linear regression. And then finally, this one's a little harder to see here. I wanted to kind of show this as this is a categorical example. So again, the number of past defaults can only be whole numbers. So you can have 1 default, 2 default. It goes up all the way to 6 in this case here, but you can't have like 1.5 default. So this is a categorical example of a variable, but we can kind of eyeball here and see, okay, the credit scores are typically lower for those that have higher numbers of defaults. And so basically as defaults go up, credit score goes down. So this is a negative relationship, right? It's going to be sloping negatively. So it's going to be starting top left and sloping to the bottom right. It is a negative relationship. And this makes sense, right? The more defaults you have, the more likelihood you're going to default in the future. And then finally here, the last variable in that decision tree is going to be, credit available. So how much credit line you have. Again, it's a positive relationship. So the slide says categorical, but it's not really categorical. It's going to have a kind of a range of how much credit you have available. You could have $5,000, you could have $5,170.10, right? It's very scalable. So you're going to have this kind of relationship here. This is a positive relationship though, where it starts at the bottom left and slopes up to the top right. Again, the more credit you have available, the higher your credit score should be. And I want to point out there are some outliers here. So there are some people that have a 900 credit score, for example, on this bottom right of the chart, and they have no credit available to them. It's a possible scenario. If you look at the far left-hand side of the chart here, there's an outlier dot at the top. It looks like they have a little more than $5,000 credit available to them, but they're still going to have a low credit score. So in the real world, you're going to have people that don't fit the mold, okay? That's okay. That's going to be the errors, the residuals. But on average, we're trying to kind of model how things work and how this is going to function in general, right? We can only decision so well, and you can build more complex models to try to fix these things, but there's always going to be people that are kind of fall through the cracks. Okay, and then finally here to kind of wrap up this video on models. So the linear regression is a little more complicated. We don't have a ton of time to go through all the nitty-gritty details here, but one thing I want to kind of cap this off with is not all models are good, right? So correlation does not equal causation. So you can have things that are sloped, have a positive slope, as we mentioned. Doesn't mean necessarily that it's going to be related. They might just, one goes up when the other one goes up. Could be caused by a third-party factor, or it could just be random occurrence. 2, people manipulate data to get the answers they want. I see this a lot on all different spectrums from all different groups, right? Somebody wants to prove a point, they want to come up with a good decision, and they want to say, oh, look at me, I'm always right, or I have a story or a narrative to tell. A lot of times people will kind of throw out data, different segments of data, so they can get the answer that they want. This is unethical, this is bad, and you can build models on it. So even though you have a model, if you have bad data, you have people that aren't doing this correctly, you can get terrible results that are actually the opposite of what is the reality and the truth here. But again, data can be manipulated, and models can be manipulated somewhat. But again, you have to kind of screw with your data and mess with it to get the answer that you want. It's not going to be factually based, and people are basically unethical. So models themselves aren't bad, but the people that are building the models and the way they do things will basically lie, cheat, and steal to make it, the answer they want. Number 3 is going to be models get complicated. So most models are not built correctly. There are a lot of assumptions that you have to make and test and derive behind the scenes. It takes a lot of time. It can take months to build, for example, a model on a specific set of data. Again, if you don't know all the testing, the robustness, and all these kind of different components that you need to put into a model development cycle, you're not going to get good models. So that's another thing to be wary of. And finally, number 4 here is people are complicated and models will fail. So as we saw in this chart, right, we had some outliers, people that don't fit the model. A lot of times trends will change. Let's say you had Beanie Babies in the 90s or Pokemon cards in the 90s, right? And people are all super excited and they buy all these things. It's the trend and it's the thing that's making all the money. Trends change. All of a sudden they go out of style and something else comes into style. So again, a model that would model that would fail because it would see the past data, it'd make a decision based on past data, but it wouldn't have a very good indication of the future because people are complicated, which cause models to fail. And then finally here, models are needed. So as we've kind of seen through this, right, making decisions is challenging for humans. A lot of times there's a lot of variables and factors going into a decision, so we do need models. Models provide an easy, unbiased way to make predictions. You have a quality of treatment as long as the models are built correctly. Humans are very biased in general, so they try to incorporate things in the past they might not realize. Again, you need models to get consistency and equality in prediction. Number two, models can provide an answer quickly, which is convenient. So imagine making a really complicated decision. You might have to think through a bunch of things and then you want to sit and think about it, and it's just hard for you to make a decision. Computers using models can make them very, very fast, which is advantageous where speed is a critical component. And then number three here, provide answers to complex questions. So again, there are questions that are so complex, humans can't really factor in everything. Even writing it down on paper becomes challenging. And so using a model might be able to incorporate a lot of different factors in a very complex situation and simplify it down to an answer that we would need or expect or kind of want out of that complex situation. Anyways, thanks for watching. I hope you guys learned a little bit more about models, why we need them, kind of some pitfalls and dangers behind modeling, as well as kind of the basic of how models work. Again, they can get more complicated. There's some math and some estimation procedures and optimization going into it. We don't need to know that for today. Just trying to give you that general perspective of how models are, how they work, and kind of evolution of decisioning in humans and why it's important to understand, right? We need to slowly build from decision trees to linear regressions, and you can go to more complex methodologies. So anyways, thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And as always, until next time.